The government becomes a market maker. Essentially, in the reverse auction, broadcasters volunteer to sell their spectrum to the government from the government's perspective at the lowest possible price. Government then proceeds to repack the remaining broadcasters and free up spectrum for the wireless carriers. Then in the forward auction, once again, the wireless carriers buy the spectrum from the government, once again from the government's perspective, at the highest possible price. And ideally, this results with very positive consequences for the Treasury and for the American people. Incentive auctions are the rarest of all Washington events. That is to say, it was a great idea hatched by the auction experts at the FCC and in academia that were seized upon by Chairman Janikowski at the beginning of his tenure as part of the National Broadband Plan, garnered support from Congress and the administration, and ultimately resulted in the changing of the law. So taking an idea from the drawing board all the way to a changed law and now to implementation is a very rare thing to which everyone involved deserves a great deal of credit. Now, however, we are presented with the challenges of implementing that law. And we have a great, in addition to an expansive panel, we also have a terrific panel to address these issues. But before we get started, we're going to have some introductory remarks from Congressman Lee Terry from Nebraska, a member of the House Energy and Commerce Committee. I've had the opportunity to work with Congressman Terry for a number of years, both when I was at the FCC and afterwards, and he's been a real leader on technology and communications issues, particularly universal service and spectrum reform. So if he's willing to tackle those incentive auctions, it's a piece of cake comparatively, I think. So with that, I'll turn it over to the Congressman, and then we'll open it up to the panel. A round of applause for Congressman Lee Terry.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that remark, and I want to recognize the guy from Hangover that's here. Oh, that's Chris from Facebook. Sorry, stand up. Yeah, thank you. Doesn't he look like the guy from Hangover, though? Should wear that baby on the front. So, an alumni of the committee, so we always make sure we recognize our friends. But this is a great issue to talk about today. I'm proud to be part of this panel, and Brian, thanks for having me here. This was really a significant lift for a committee. You would think it wouldn't be. There's a necessity for more spectrum, and I don't know if these conversations go on in your household, but I have my 18-year-old son here with me this week, or he's wandering around the floor as I'm up here speaking because I'm boring. It's exciting down there. So we made that priority, but a typical conversation in our household, while my one son is on his iPad, another one on his Mac, and another one on their iPod, three boys, all sitting around in the same room, and then you'll get the oldest that'll say, "Jack, turn off your computer, I need to get off YouTube." Well, those conversations are occurring not only in the Terry household, but all across this nation, in malls and coffee shops, whatever. The reality is the young people today in business today don't want wires. It's all about mobility. And I assume that a lot of the technologies that we're seeing out on the floor today encompass this one principle of the mobile society. It's not cars anymore that make us mobile, it's our devices that make us mobile. So, how do we accomplish the goal of more spectrum to be auctioned off into the marketplace so that we have higher speeds that don't force somebody to have to shut down their YouTube so somebody else could get on their school portal and take their test? And by the way, that's exactly what's happening in our school district, is our kids get on the school portal and take their time tests from home, sitting at our counter in our kitchen. And those are all done on wireless devices. So, we get to hear a discussion of how the FCC is going to develop these rules, and I'm anxious. We had a hearing on this, and my conclusion from our hearing is we're still debating many of these issues. Because here, when we package this spectrum together, we set out some goals. One of them was we have to focus on the goal of getting more broadband, wireless broadband, and spectrum out into the marketplace. That's what this is all about. We want to create more jobs. We understand that as this spectrum is released and technology grows, that jobs will be created. But let's not fool ourselves The major underlying, maybe unstated reason for this auction is the money. It was estimated that we could raise $24 billion. That's not specifically laid out, but I can guarantee you that was part of the discussions. So we want the FCC to design the rules that get us at least $24 billion. No problem, right? Within that $24 billion, we assume that $7 billion of that is going to be used for public safety. That was part of the negotiations and grand bargain that got us the plan that was inserted into the, oh God, that deficit reduction, debt limit plan. That was ugly, wasn't that, Neil? So, and then $3 billion to buy the spectrum from the broadcasters. How the FCC is going to set up rules to use only $3 billion to buy back from TV stations spectrum when they know that they've got all the leverage. All they get to do is say, no, we aren't selling it, and they only get to then up the amount of money, and we can see where that $3 billion is going to go pretty quickly. And I'd like to hear from some of our panelists how we expect them to be reasonable in negotiations and giving back some of their spectrum so that we can have enough to reach $24 billion overall. And then about another $1 billion in cats and dogs, mostly public safety related, 911 enhancement, those type of things. So you can see that this is not an easy prospect to get the level of spectrum, the amount of spectrum we need back from the TV stations and other broadcasters, and then have an auction, a reverse auction, that's done in a way that maximizes the number of bidders and the amount that they're going to bid. And in our hearing that we had a few weeks ago, I don't know if we ever came to a consensus on the best way to do that, but I do feel personally that the more participants in an auction, I've attended enough that know if you've got a lot of them bidding as opposed to one or two bidding, you get better results at an auction. So I'm proud to be part of this panel today and kick it off because I want to hear how we're going to actually accomplish that. So Brian, thank you for letting me be part of this forum, and let's get going.
Thank you very much. So the structure of our panel, consistent with Congressman Terry's entreaty, is that Bill Lake will begin, the Media Bureau Chief, and give an overview of implementation in the state of play today. And then we'll open up to our panel. I'm going to introduce everyone now and then throw it over to Bill. So Charla Rath, the Vice President of Wireless Policy Development at Verizon. Mark Freitrick, Vice President and Chief Economist at BIA Kelsey. Neil Freed, Chief Counsel, Communications Subcommittee, House Energy and Commerce Committee. John Branscombe, Senior Communications Counsel, Senate Commerce Committee. Paul Margie, Partner, Wiltshire Grannis. And Rick Kaplan, Executive Vice President, Strategic Planning at the NAB. So that is our star-studded panel. We will start with our leading star, Mr. Lake, Chief Lake, who will give an overview of where we stand on implementation.
Thanks, Brian. It is remarkable how far the incentive auction idea has come in a very short time. As Brian mentioned, Chairman Janikowski made this visionary idea a centerpiece of his broadband policy when he unveiled the National Broadband Plan in March 2010. He pushed it as a top priority from that day on, in the face of skepticism on many fronts. Then it took less than a year between the time when legislation was introduced in Congress and when the President signed the Spectrum Act, adopted with broad bipartisan support. But a lot of work remains to make the first incentive auction reality. The notice of proposed rulemaking we released in September lays out our thinking so far about how to get there from here. And it invites help from all quarters to make sure we get this done right. We'll be looking for helpful comments on the 25th of this month and replies on March 12th to enable us to adopt an order this year and hold an auction in 2014. An incentive auction makes sense because the reality is that some broadcasters are making very good use of their spectrum. They're in a position to continue to innovate and to continue to meet consumer needs, but some are not. For some broadcasters, the opportunity to contribute their spectrum to the auction, to help to meet the booming demand for mobile broadband, and to share in auction proceeds may be very attractive. Our job at the Commission is to design an auction that will make it easy for broadcasters to size up that opportunity, to decide whether to participate, and at the same time will allow the broadcast industry itself to emerge from the auction stronger than ever. Some of the key challenges we explore in the notice, and I'm sorry, Congressman, we have more questions than answers at this point, include first, how to coordinate the reverse and the forward auction. An incentive auction is really two auctions at once. We have an auction in which the broadcasters will offer their spectrum, and another in which carriers and others will compete to buy it. Success on each side will depend on success on the other side. Does that mean that the auctions should be simultaneous, and how can we do that? We ask in the notice how broadcasters should submit their bids. One possibility is a single round sealed bid auction, in which, in effect, each broadcaster writes on a piece of paper the price it would accept for its spectrum. But a competing option that we've floated is a descending clock auction in which the FCC would declare a high beginning price in a particular market for spectrum. Each station would then say whether it was willing to accept that price, and then the price would be lowered in stages until the right number of offers remain. One advantage, we think, of the second approach may be that it would make very simple the decision by any broadcaster whether to say yes or no to a particular price. We ask for help in deciding exactly how to implement the command of the statute that when we repack the broadcast band, we make all reasonable efforts to preserve the coverage area and the population served by each TV licensee. We ask how best to design a forward auction that accommodates the fact that we won't know in advance how much spectrum we have to sell. One approach that may help is to auction off generic blocks of spectrum, say in 5 megahertz bytes, rather than taking bids separately on each specific spectrum block. Finally, we ask for help in designing the transition for broadcasters so that we can reimburse their costs of changing channels within the $1.75 billion cap set by Congress and within the 3-year time limit that Congress gave us. These only scratch the surface of the many questions we have to answer before we hold the auction. A forum such as this is one of the ways in which we're reaching out for all the input and help we can get. And I look forward to hearing what my colleagues here have to say. Thank you.
Great, Bill. Thank you very much. So based on the size of our panel, everyone has assured me they're going to give very rapid-fire answers. So we're going to see how successful this entreaty has been as well. So let's start with Mark, actually. One of the key issues that we're all considering is in order for any of this to work, there has to be sufficient level of broadcaster interest to involuntary participation in order for the repacking and the forward auction to make any sense. So will there be enough interest, and what are the key sort of drivers on the broadcaster side?
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, I think there will be a significant amount of interest by broadcasters. There have been broadcast companies, I'll call them investors, who have purchased stations in the last few years with clear indications that they were going to participate. A lot has been made that there hasn't been many over-the-air broadcasters who have come out to say that they are going to participate. But you have to remember that they have operations that they got to continue, so there's no incentives for them to come out now and say we're going to shut down, we're going to share, we're going to move to VHF 2 years ahead, 2 or maybe longer. We'll get to that question later. When the auction occurs. So I think there is some potential. I think one of the things that broadcasters, some broadcasters haven't fully appreciated yet is the dollar value of this spectrum in the forward auction part of the upcoming auction. And that dollar value is going to be very high, And as a result, if the commission does adopt the declining clock, the check that the FCC will pay to local broadcasters is quite substantial. Fearful that Congressman Terry, we may not get to that $26 billion, or in the net proceeds, but I think when broadcasters start realizing that the value of that spectrum for some of them is going to be quite significant.
So Bill flagged a couple of variables. Are there any descending clock versus sealed bids, some of the other issues? Is there any right answer in terms of maximizing broadcaster participation from either your perspective or any of our other panelists? Yeah.
I'll just add that there was initial skepticism, but we already have a group that many may have heard of, led by Preston Padden, that represents 25 broadcasters in the top 10 markets. Now, they're not all necessarily going to participate. They may actually even be competing with each other to exit the market. But it's still a very good sign early on that there is interest, as we just talked about. But the rules are going to have to be carefully crafted to encourage them to participate. If they think that they are not going to be able to get the top dollar they think they deserve, they'll make a bid and either not get accepted or maybe not even participate.
I just want to point out that in the NPRM, there's a lot of places where the FCC staff had indicated setting up rules to make it quite attractive to broadcasters. The confidentiality, various other issues that I think is it's a good step insofar as encouraging broadcasters.
Okay, let's go back to Neil. Congressman Terry highlighted the $24 billion question. How do the financial requirements of the broadcast incentive auctions sort of drive some of the other policy decisions? Does it have any ramifications for licensed versus unlicensed, eligibility restrictions, yes, mandates, interoperability, et cetera?
Mr. Terry sort of hit it on the head. There are these three goals of getting spectrum for mobile broadband, creating jobs and investment, and raising $7 billion for a public safety network. The only way to really do those three things, really, is to maximize the amount of spectrum we make available in an auction, to keep that auction open, and to put as few conditions on the spectrum we auction as possible. The band plan is also going to be very, very important. And one thing that makes many of us a little nervous is that, at least in the NPRM, the FCC is already talking about pulling out as much as 26 megahertz that would not be auctioned. They're talking about it's just the proposal, and obviously this band plan has to be discussed, and there are comments coming in now, but there would be as many as 2 6 megahertz guard bands, which under the statute must be only as large as is technically reasonable. The FCC then proceeds to say it might expand those guard bands another 4 megahertz each to a total of 10 beyond that. And we also have channel 37, which is another 6 megahertz. If you look at comparable spectrum in a recent auction, that spectrum, if sold, could be worth in the neighborhood of $20 billion. We cannot take $20 billion off the table at the get-go and really expect to meet all of our objectives. We don't know how much money will be needed to pay broadcasters who want to relinquish. We do not know how much money will be required to relocate the broadcasters that remain. We do not know how much we're actually going to raise in the spectrum that we sell, because we don't know how much we have, and we don't know what the final price will be. So our concern is that we don't take money off the table at the start. Now, the great thing here is we don't need to. This is a balanced piece of legislation. You can create guard bands, you can allow unlicensed use, and you can still auction this spectrum in a way that maximizes revenue. There can be unlicensed use in guard bands, there can be guard bands in this spectrum, but there's nothing in the law that says it shouldn't be auctioned. And when you talk about sizable amounts of spectrum, I think it makes sense to auction it. You can still do unlicensed in that space. You still have the white spaces. The law makes clear that the white spaces will continue. And in fact, the FCC's NPRM says there will still be, after this auction, significant amounts of white space spectrum available. We also identify over 190 gigahertz of spectrum in the 5 gigahertz band. I'm sorry, 190 megahertz in the 5 gigahertz band. Get my megs and my gigs straight. But it is still a sizable amount of spectrum. And as Commissioner Pai identified in our hearing, it is ideal for the type of unlicensed Wi-Fi services that we talk about. It travels short distances, so we don't have interference issues. Many believe it's actually even better than the white spaces spectrum. So if we focus our attention there in the 5 gigahertz, we can use that for the unlicensed services we really are focusing on. We can auction this prime spectrum down on the 600 megahertz, raise the money we need for public safety, and actually meet all of our objectives.
All right, rapid fire, rapid fire. Okay, so John or Paul, you want to weigh in on that, or just completely agree with Neil? Feel free to do that if you want, whatever you think.
I usually do agree with Neil, but I guess, I mean, Neil's right. Certainly the law doesn't make it easy on the FCC, right? The law has a number of competing priorities and demands. So, one of the things that the law does a number of things, right? So at its basic, it provides spectrum for public safety to build out a nationwide wireless interoperable broadband network, and it provides funds to build out that network, and it authorizes the incentive auctions and directs specific spectrum bands to be auctioned, and the revenues from both of those would go to fund the public safety network. I think that was, for Senator Rockefeller, my boss, that is certainly, was his top priority among the priorities, but again, there are multiple priorities. So the law allows the FCC to create guard bands, as Neil said, that are technically reasonable, and allows unlicensed operations in those bands. That was an important compromise in the final law. We all, certainly from the Senate side, that's the only I can speak from. We certainly didn't get everything we wanted. Compromise is probably, that was the best way. And this whole idea between, guard bands are only technically reasonable, the ability to make unlicensed use in those bands, while also recognizing, as all the FCC commissioners have done, the importance to raise money to fund this new broadband network for our first responders.
So I think, look, I agree that the FCC has a really hard job in front of it to do this. I think in setting up a band plan, it's going to have to create predictability. It's going to have to find a way to achieve some of the balances we've talked about. But in comparing these things, first off, I think it's important to understand, I'd like to understand the $20 billion number that you discussed, because it's important to compare apples to apples here. If we're saying that this is a megahertz pop calculation comparing guard band spectrum to non-guard band spectrum, I'm not sure that we're saying that this is a $20 billion delta. So number one is I'd love to understand those numbers a little more. Number two is that Paul Milgram, who's I think recognized as one of the world's experts on these issues, has said that designating unlicensed spectrum will not reduce the overall take that the government has from these auctions because of three things. Two things. One, a reduction in the amount of supply affects the calculation that everybody makes in determining how much they're going to pay per unit. So we have an adjustment that will happen if you have guard band spectrum that's appropriately held aside and given to unlicensed. That's number one. Number two is that historically, Milgram shows that the auction values and the auction take that the government gets is defined more by aggregate budgets of the people that are bidding than by a simple megahertz to megahertz calculation. And so you add those two things together, it may be that we get two great values by setting aside appropriate, technically reasonable guard bands and duplex gaps here in order to have an unlicensed presence in the 600 megahertz band. And we also have to recognize the big picture here. So we have the amount of money that the FCC, the check the FCC is going to write to the federal government, but then we have the much, much, much larger contribution to the national economy that we get by a balanced licensed and unlicensed approach. You look down on the floor and what do you see? You see licensed and unlicensed working hand in hand in almost all the innovative devices. And so if we achieve that, this long-term FCC strategy of making sure that we have licensed resources and unlicensed resources, low barrier to entry spectrum and somewhat higher barrier to entry spectrum for different types of applications, then we have the type of investment we need. And we see that, we see the huge numbers that have unlicensed have produced. And then last, 5 gigahertz. 5 gigahertz is critical. It's critical spectrum. It's really good. But not all 5 gigahertz is the same. The 5 gigahertz band has the Uni 1 band, the Uni 2, the Uni 2 extended, and the Uni 3. Everyone's using Uni 3 because it's got high power and it doesn't have the sharing. And I know Neil has spoken about the limitations of sharing. We may have these new 2 bands that are going to be government shared bands at low power and with DFS requirements. That's going to increase cost. It's going to be an indoor only use potentially, and that's going to reduce the value of those things. So I think it's dangerous to say that 5 gigahertz is a replacement, a government shared spectrum band of 5 gigahertz at low power and potentially with DFS is a replacement for clean 600 megahertz spectrum.
Okay, so I'm going to let Neil counterpunch, but I do want to say Congressman Terry has a great Uni 1, Uni 2, Uni 3 joke at some point. It's in the queue for later. But so Neil quickly, and then I want to bring Charlotte in a little bit from a licensed carrier perspective.
So let me point out, that's a false choice. I'm not saying in lieu of unlicensed. Let me give you an important statistic. Today, without any discussion of this spectrum, there is 670 megahertz of spectrum below 6 gigahertz already available for unlicensed use. That is not going away, and we increase that in the legislation with the spectrum we're talking about at 5 gigahertz. That's more than the 580 megahertz of spectrum available today below 6 gigahertz for licensed use. We have plenty of great unlicensed spectrum available to us. We are making only more available. The point I'm making is that if we take a third of the spectrum available to us in this new law and set it aside not for auction, I think we've created an artificial scarcity that will go much, much farther. It could be a tipping point. And I don't think that artificial scarcity will offset the amount of revenue we lose. And don't forget, it's not just about revenue. This is ideal spectrum for mobile broadband. This low megahertz spectrum is perfect for this purpose. We identified it. We're going to a lot of trouble to clear it. Let's keep our eye on that goal there and look at white spaces, other unlicensed use, and 5 gigahertz.
All right, Charlotte, you want to jump in? Bill's got to surrender your microphone there for a second.
You know, frankly, we are actually spending most of our time looking at what is, in fact, technically reasonable. I'm not going to engage right now in the issue of licensed, unlicensed, how big the band should be, whether they should be auctioned or not. But it is, you know, it is a really very interesting question that the Commission has before it, as well as, you know, frankly, this reminds me a little bit of what I deal with in the office on a regular basis. We spend an inordinate amount of time talking about the band plan. It is extremely important, but there are also a lot of other issues before us in this particular notice. And, you know, I would actually argue that the hardest thing that we've got to do, and not to say that this isn't hard, I think we're going to have to deal with it. The hardest thing we have to do is actually that balance between what is technically the best possible band plan you can have, you know, according to our engineers who, you know, they would design the perfect band plan, but then what can actually be auctioned. And here I'm not talking necessarily about, you know, the unlicensed portion. What I'm talking about is the whole band plan, is, you know, to draw in, you know, we haven't really talked too much about how this is going to work. And I think some people in the audience probably know as much as I do about this, and then there are others who probably don't know a lot. The way this is going to work is that we as, you know, possible participants will actually have a different band plan put before us every, you know, so-called stage of the auction, because the Commission just can't possibly know how much spectrum it has on the table. Now, frankly, that's where I'm spending an awful lot of my time, thinking about that issue and how, as a potential participant in an auction, how do you make that work? And, you know, I would actually argue that, you know, that for me right now is probably the most important issue. And then I don't disagree that there are important issues on the unlicensed side, but you know, I'm actually, like I said, you know, as I think probably the only one here who might possibly spend money in this auction. That's what we're thinking.
We're going to bid, actually.
Just, yeah. And I said might, by the way.
Might, I understood. I heard it right. Of course. No commitments are made on this panel. So I want to try and bring in Rick a little bit, if I can, on maybe on the band plan and what some of the other things that broadcasters are looking at as we move forward in implementation. And I want to maybe pull Paul back in on the band plan as well. So, Rick?
Sure. I mean, this is a really interesting process. I mean, the FCC convinced Congress to conduct this experiment, which we'll get a sense of whether or not the value that the FCC saw in spectrum for mobile broadband, where it lies vis-a-vis the value it has for broadcasters. So the FCC's job now is to make it as easy as possible for broadcasters to participate, which I know it's working on quite a bit, but there are so many issues. Charlotte just delved into one of a number, so I find it somewhat amusing at some of the timetables I hear for trying to complete this. I think Congress was very reasonable, gave people a lot of time, 2020. I'm not saying that's where we should be remotely, but there are so many issues the FCC is grappling with now, and the most important thing for the FCC is to get it right as opposed to getting it done. We haven't even talked about repacking, which this will be the most complex task the FCC has faced ever with respect to broadcasters. The DTV transition doesn't hold a candle to what is going to have to happen. You take something in the DTV transition over the span of a decade with multiple rounds of comment, with broadcasters coming in and seeing where the mistakes were made, where they weren't. Here, it'll be in a space of a month, 2 months, an entire repacking scheme that's going to happen over and over again, as Charlotte was talking about with respect to the band plan. The band plan switches so many times based on repacking scenarios. That's incredibly difficult. You have a band plan that needs to be set up, that Charlotte was talking about, which has to be based on engineering and nothing else. The most important thing, and this is what we get into the debate on license, what you do with it, it's going to be guided by engineering. It's going to be guided by companies who are trying to figure out what the best way to figure out what technically reasonable is, what can go there, how you maximize the efficiency of that spectrum. And then we haven't even talked about coordinating with Canada and Mexico, which is a contingent precedent in the auction even going forward, which is an enormously complex task and actually could sink the entire auction if not done correctly, because you don't want to eliminate a third of the country because you haven't worked out agreements with, especially Canada, but Canada and Mexico. And so to get a successful auction, which I think we're all very committed to, there's a lot that needs to be done, and we're all working very hard, everyone up here, many of you in the audience, but I think we really just need to focus on making sure we get these things right as opposed to getting it done immediately.
But you know, the very good news is in an event that rivals the reunion of the Eagles, we have the NAB and the CTIA filing jointly at the FCC for an extension of time to file comments to look at concerns with the band plan. That's a very good development. These guys are working together to get the engineering right. You know, we don't know, is 6 megahertz the right amount of spectrum for a guard band? We don't know. We don't have the engineering analysis yet. But whatever the right amount is, it's got to be technically reasonable. And the FCC can't just expand the amount of spectrum available for guard bands for reasons unrelated to preventing interference. So let's get that engineering on the table and build that band plan.
Paul, did you want to jump in? And I know, Charlotte, you were thinking about it as well.
I actually agree, and I think that engineering is going to drive this, and Rick and Charlotte and others have done really exceptional work. The FCC put a band plan on the table, several band plans on the table, and I think a lot of us up here are sitting down and analyzing that and trying to figure out what the best technical way of doing it will be. Look, a good band plan by the FCC gives engineers and innovators predictability. You know, good fences make good neighbors in band plans. It achieves balance, and it means that the engineers and innovators are the ones that drive how that band is used rather than the policymakers. And so that's the goal. I think when we're doing that, as we look at things like guard bands or duplex gaps or whatever else, it is going to be the engineering that drives it, and broadcasters and carriers and companies with unlicensed interests are all sitting down together. Their engineers are sitting down together, not their lawyers, and trying to figure out what the best way of doing this is. And the FCC is a good place to make this decision. They're going to have to look and say, all right, if we shrink the size of a guard band, are we going to, is that going to result in higher component costs that we have to pass through to consumers because we have exotic filters? Is it going to mean that we have diminished consumer performance for consumers because we have cell size that shrink? Does it mean that the amount of auction revenue we get is less because we have a nearby band that's degraded because there's too small a guard band? So I think we all agree that the thing that's gonna that we all have to be working on is getting that technical work done well.
Now, Charlotte, did you want to jump in, or are you going to?
Yeah, just very quickly, and I don't disagree that the band plan needs to be done, you know, technically very well. But this is, again, it's a complicated reverse and forward auction. So there will be auction components that will have a direct impact on how the band plan is put together. So, and it's one of the things, as I said earlier, that we're constantly talking to our engineers about it. It is actually important that you get the best possible band plan, but there might have to be some tweaks to it as a result of how the commission is also trying to auction this spectrum. So I just wanted to...
Bill, I want to bring you back in if I can. You know, I think there's a somewhat, at times, a simplistic view that broadcasters have the option of either participating in incentive auction or they are not going to participate at all, and they give up everything or they give up nothing. And the commission outlined a number of different options that broadcasters are presented with in addition to sort of surrendering their spectrum or just staying where they are. Can you talk through what those different options are in terms of channel sharing, accepting interference, UHF, VHF? Outline those a little bit, and then I'm going to turn to Mark a little bit and talk about the importance of those from the industry perspective as well.
Yes, we've talked about the simple option of surrendering a license or not, but The other options stem largely from the fact that we did go through a DTV transition. And with digital television, it's now possible, as you all know, to deliver more than one stream of programming in a 6 megahertz broadcast channel. Many broadcasters are taking advantage of that now by doing multicasting. But it also means that we can, in our rules, create a situation now in which 2 broadcast licensees could share a 6 megahertz channel. And what we've proposed is that that would be an option available to broadcasters. They would each remain a licensee, they'd each retain their must-carry rights and so forth, but they could share the capacity of a 6 megahertz channel in whatever proportion and whatever way they work out as a private contractual matter. We also learned in the DTV transition that the VHF spectrum, which was always considered the beachfront property, has some reception difficulties with digital transmission, and therefore it's generally considered to be less desirable than UHF spectrum. But it is a way of reaching your audience without sacrificing capacity. You still have 6 megahertz of capacity. So we've proposed also to offer the option of having a station volunteer to go from UHF to VHF for a share of auction proceeds that it would set. We've also asked for, these are basically the 3 options that we proposed early and that are reflected in the statute. We've also asked whether there should be other options in this auction for broadcasters. One that we sort of ran up the flagpole was the question of a broadcaster voluntarily agreeing to accept more interference from other stations than it would otherwise be required to accept under our rules, again for a share of auction proceeds that it would determine. We'll watch with great interest to see if anyone salutes that option in the comments, or if nobody likes it, then we won't offer it. But what we're trying to do is to make this something that enables broadcasters to basically chart their own future, to decide what's good for them, and at the same time take advantage of the financial opportunity that the auction offers.
Before we switch to Mark, I want to have a follow-up with you, Bill. One of the critiques that's been raised, admittedly by people who don't have to run an auction coming up and didn't have to write an NPRM, is that this should be much more simple. You know, that it's too complicated, that we need to simplify, simplify, simplify. This is an area where the commission offered additional choices from what was originally in the statute, so arguably made it more complex. Can you just flesh out for a little bit, like, why the complexity may be justified in this aspect of the auction, and sort of to answer the critics that we've made it, that notice makes it too complicated?
Yes, and I'll leave the option of accepting greater interference aside, because that might be very complex to implement, and that may be something that will kill the option itself. But the others, we think, do offer significant flexibility for broadcasters without great additional complexity. For example, channel sharing in an auction context is really just surrendering a channel, because what would happen would be 2 stations would agree among themselves to share one of their channels, and they would submit the other channel in the auction. So in the auction, that's not an additional complexity. It's just somebody's offering up a channel having made a private deal to share with someone else. And ultimately, this is very complex. You can hear from all of the comments we've heard this morning. This is not an easy matter, but what we're trying to do is to have the commission handle the complexity so that, in particular, the options available for broadcasters can be simply understood and simply chosen. And again, that's one of the attractions of the declining clock auction, is that in a particular market, a broadcaster could simply say, well, the price is at this. If it stays at that, I'm in. If it drops below this, I'm out. Don't have to hire auction experts to make that decision. They just have to know what's my walkaway price and what isn't.
All right, now we'll bring in Mark and then maybe Rick after that.
Sure. The aspect that Bill just brought up about the sharing is very intriguing insofar as that broadcasters can still continue to broadcast, though it is fraught with lots of different potential problems. This is an arrangement in perpetuity. You can't get rid of your shared partner for any time in the future, and obviously any potential new owner of that shared facility. So that's an important consideration. On the other hand, the opportunity that the FCC suggests in the NPRM of sharing with Class A stations, the Class A stations that have much lower power and lower coverage area is very intriguing, because they can then boost up their power to the full power station level. So their coverage area may be quite increased, and thus they may be very interested in sharing. And obviously, if you're the full power television station, you may be able to get more of the proceeds of that opportunity. The opportunity of moving to the high VHF band is also intriguing, though a lot of broadcasters are very concerned about the mobile DTV opportunities and the difficulties in the mobile DTV, and many broadcasters are committing to that. The last thing, and Bill made reference that maybe the auctioning off, increased accepting interference may be a little complicated. I read that and I just said, I don't know how that's going to happen. I mean, I'm not an engineer, and I'm sure we can probably figure out some rules and so on, but given that we're operating these two auctions at the same time while the dynamic repacking plan is occurring, I just always quote Imus in the morning, it makes my hair hurt. And that just makes my hair hurt even more.
Mr. Kaplan, is your hair hurting? How are things down there?
I'm losing it.
Yeah, maybe that's why.
It doesn't really hurt. It's gone. I mean, I think the important thing, and the way we look at it is, you have to take this process from sort of the rooms of the FCC where it's conceived to this group here and others. I look at it very pragmatically. What will get an auction that's successful? What will get a band plan that makes sense for Charlotte's company and others to participate in an auction that gets more mobile broadband out there, that gets Congressman Terry the money he's looking for? And I think we need to be really pragmatic about it. Let's face it, channel sharing, I think it's very unlikely that it'll be successful in the auction, just to be clear. To me, it's a way of not killing off diversity in broadcasting. I mean, we're talking about minority ownership and the ownership proceeding going on, but to me, it's the companies most likely, the family-owned businesses most likely to participate. A lot of them happen to be minority-owned, and so so encouraging them to maybe channel share, really focusing on that might be a good goal for channel sharing. But the reality is, how do you get to that band plan? Keep it simple. Brian, you mentioned it, and so for us, it's figuring out how do you take the engineering, how do you figure out the way to get between repacking and auction, who's really going to participate in those big markets. Let's be honest, the broadcast stations are worth far more than you'll get in an auction from wireless carriers. They just are. Other markets, that may not be the case, but the ones where you really need. So figuring out a way to get between repacking and the auction to make it as attractive as possible for broadcasters. And one concern on the broadcasting end, Neil mentioned Preston's group, which is doing interesting work, but the problem is they're looking for a big payday. I'm sure a lot of those private equity folks are coming in. They're used to getting not a little bit of a margin over what they might, their station might be worth into the future, but they're going to be looking for, a lot of money, and that then goes cross purposes with what Congress is trying to achieve. So for us, it's not getting every last megahertz from the auction, not looking at an additional 5, 10 megahertz of downlink spectrum, which, by the way, is less valuable to wireless carriers than the paired spectrum that they're really looking for. It's how do you get to a band plan that works, that makes people want to participate, and how do you allow room for other services? I mean, you have the unlicensed guys, you have wireless mic, you have lots of things that can go on there, but it's really looking at the end game here and taking it out of the academic, which is where it started when it was proposed to Congress, and actually getting the job done. And that's what I think everyone here is really focused on doing.
So I want to bring John and Neil back in, and maybe Congressman Terry as well. Presumably, members of Congress will not be weighing in on what the OOBE limit should be and sundry other highly technical elements of this debate, but there will be certain sort of guideposts of things that are sort of integral to the balance that was struck in the legislation and things that are very important for individual members in the committee. So what are some of those things that as Bill and the team at the commission move forward with implementation, they should keep their eyes on in terms of what the bogeys are for Congress?
Who do you want to start
with? I want to hear from you.
Very political. Very deferential.
So as Chairman Walden has said, Congress's work actually starts, not ends, with passage of a law. We will be doing oversight. In fact, before the year ended, we actually had our first oversight hearing that Mr. Terry referred to. So we are going to be looking at all aspects of this. The repacking has to be fair. The rules have to be right to encourage as much participation, both by broadcasters and the wireless carriers that might be interested in purchasing the spectrum. But we have a very happy coincidence here. The very largest markets, where some of these stations are perhaps most valuable, also have the most broadcasters. And that's also where we need the spectrum most, because in the smaller markets, we actually have a lot of stations that are not broadcasting. There are far fewer. So if you're the 25th station in a major market, yeah, maybe station number 1 has a very high exit price, but station 25 may have a rather lower exit price. And what the point of the auction is to get those exit prices. We're not trying to force anybody off the air. If these stations really don't think they're going to get enough money, to exit, we don't want them to exit, because what they're saying is our station is more valuable on the air than we will raise or generate for the Treasury and for the economy by repurposing our spectrum for wireless services. But to make that work, we have to strip down, try to make this an open auction, no conditions, so that we do maximize, we get a true price. The wireless operator can say, I'm going to spend this money because this is really what that spectrum is worth. And the broadcaster can say, well, I'll take that amount because this is what I'm prepared to leave the market for. I think we have a great opportunity. I'm actually very bullish. I think this will work because I believe the way the markets will work, I believe the way the auction will work will get us to the right intersection point.
So I certainly think that, you know, from Senator Rockefeller's perspective, the FCC is off to a good start, right? I mean, all these concerns that have been raised validate the reason to turn over so many of these decisions to the expert agency, to get public comment, the smart people, the stakeholders to weigh in, to really get the right answer, you know, technically, economically, what have you. And, you know, I think Congress, as Neil said, certainly Congress will be watching closely how this plays out. I think some of these concerns are premature until we get the comments in and the FCC has a chance to, you know, digest those and talk to the relevant folks. But in terms of how the FCC rather balances these competing demands between making sure there's revenue to cover the public safety network, you know, protecting broadcasters and getting mobile broadband out, whether it's either licensed or unlicensed, and that right balance, I don't think we're prejudging. I think, for, you know, as I said, certainly for Senator Rockefeller, I think the public safety network is his #1 priority, but there are other competing priorities, and how the FCC does it, I think Congress will be watching it very closely.
Congressman Terry, you want to weigh in?
Yes, we will be watching it very closely. to state so that we can meet our unstated and stated goals. How we do that is going to be fairly high level. As Neil mentioned, we will continue to do hearings. We even had a second hearing that wasn't necessarily an oversight, but maybe a suggestion on new standards or technologies in receivers to be able to reduce interference and therefore narrow the guard bands. We will have continued discussions like that. We will have continued oversight. The tough part for them is maybe what we come up on our side of the aisle is going to be countered by NASU and others with competing or contrary advice. So frankly, I think most of us will stay, you know, at the 30,000-foot level, watch, make suggestions here and there, but mostly just keep watch of how this is progressing.
Thank you, Congressman Terry. You just stayed after your remarks, and we had to bring you back into the panel. I know that wasn't part of the original bargain. Yeah, it was good. There you go. So I want to bring Paul and Charlotte back in and talk a little bit about, look, this is the Consumer Electronics Show. We've all been on the floor, seen some extraordinary innovation and investment, candidly, in spectrum-based services. What would this look like? What will the impact of the incentive auctions be on the things we see on the floor, on individual companies' plans? And Charlotte, I know your company may or may not be bidding, but just talk about the general need for spectrum and what it means to the consumer experience, some of the talking points that Lowell touched on yesterday.
Yeah, sure. In fact, I was going to mention that. The one thing I also wanted to mention here is we're focused here on incentive auctions. But as a country, I think we also need to be focused on spectrum from a lot of different sources, because, you know, anybody who walks on the floor knows that, you know, I haven't been able to do the count, but I'm going to guess, you know, the vast majority of things we're seeing down there have some sort of wireless component to them. It is what, you know, we were talking about earlier, or what the congressman said about people wanting to be mobile. But I'd actually add to that, too, that this is not just about the mobility that we're seeing now, but this is about the types of things that, you know, our Chairman Lowell McAdam talked about yesterday. This is about, you know, healthcare applications. This is about education. This is about energy. This is about a vision of the future that I think all of us have. It's a funny thing. If you have two different places talking about these issues. You have the people who talked about things like shared success and, you know, our own powerful answers, or you're talking about how do you actually really have a digital, you know, a digital country where, you know, telematics is the norm as opposed to just a pie in the sky. But then we, in this group, all sit around and talk about spectrum. Well, the fact is that the two are inextricably linked. And, you know, I think that more of the kinds of conversations where we are talking about those two things together would be very valuable. And I'm not suggesting it's all licensed spectrum. I mean, it could, you know, it's unlicensed, it's licensed, it's a combination. But I think that there's an important dialogue that needs to take place about, you know, what is it that we're talking about when we say that there is an increased need for spectrum, and it's not just about, you know, dancing cats.
Although dancing cats are very important.
Though dancing cats are great.
See them on YouTube.
Yeah. Paul?
I think I'd say just about the same thing. I think it's critical that we have this licensed spectrum and unlicensed spectrum. I think we can all kind of talk here about the details of how much it should be, but I think you see downstairs that there's a real symbiotic relationship between them. You know, I think a good outcome here, a good band plan, a good incentive auction process in whole would be to create the foundation. So the innovators in this place can make those decisions on how it's going to be used. I could guess about how people would use the 600 megahertz band or 3.5 or 5 or any of the other ones that we're talking about. I'd likely be wrong in making those guesses. I mean, we have some good history of how people have used other bands and low bands, and you see smart meters in the sub 1 gigahertz band in the US versus Europe, and the access to unlicensed spectrum there has made a big difference. You see Internet of Things emerging and the need for low barrier to entry spectrum for the Internet of Things, and the expansion of RFID from inside to outside type applications. And so there's a lot on the horizon, but if I make a guess, I'll almost certainly be wrong.
All right, well, I want to throw out an open, just sort of a jump ball question for our panel, and then we'll do an exit question. What is the most complex or underappreciated element or issue presented in the notice, and why? What is something that maybe we haven't talked about yet that's out there that's very important to this debate that maybe we haven't talked about? Anyone? Mark?
I'll start off, and we started talking about it. Charlotte made some reference to it as well with Rick in terms of the repacking. This repacking is going to be dynamic, and depending if Station A in Market 7 decides to opt out in the third stage, it affects all 20 stations along the eastern seaboard and the reconfiguration of this. And so that integration of the repacking while these auctions are going on, really is really challenging.
Others?
I'll echo that point, and just to elaborate, so that raises the real question. Does everybody get one crack, or do people get to revise their bids? Do we have multiple rounds? Is this done simultaneously? Is it done sequentially? Those are really difficult questions that the FCC has teed up. How do we make sure everybody can adjust to what's going on around them so we do maximize the opportunities to relocate broadcasters in a reasonable way and to compensate them for that, while making sure we get a national swath of spectrum that we can auction? We don't have the answer. We need to know, is it multi-round, simultaneous, sequential? But everyone needs to be able to see what's going on around them for this to work.
Rick?
Apart from repacking, which I mentioned before, I do just want to reiterate, again, the border issues for both wireless carriers and broadcasters are enormous. And the FCC has a fundamental decision to make. Does it want to go forward with this sort of 2014 timeframe for finishing the auction, which clearly it won't negotiate anything with Canada or Mexico by then, and therefore leave out, again, this currently extends as far as New York, the protection areas. This 400 kilometers from the border. Or does the FCC want to really make inroads with Canada and Mexico to free up those areas so that, again, broadcasters can move, so you can repack more stations in a way that makes sense. And you have, for Charlotte's company, who's experienced this in the past, they won't have interference problems or challenges. They can use more of the spectrum in places like Seattle, Detroit, Chicago, New York. So the FCC's got to make that determination. If you go for speed, the FCC knows, because it's in the statute, it's going to eliminate, you're going to have to at least have two band plans, the border band plan and the rest of the country. If we try and work it out in advance, you could actually free up more spectrum and have, in my view, a more successful auction.
Anyone else on the hidden complex issue?
I could get really geeky and
go for it.
And
go for it.
talk about what portions of the forward auction that, you know, one thing we haven't talked about here is that part of what the Commission is doing is taking an opportunity to update its 20-year-old auction rules and to do it a little bit differently. And there are myriad issues that that are related to its new proposal of doing a clock auction on the forward side as well. I'm not going to go into the details, but they're just, I think there's things about assignment rounds and other things that we just haven't spent a lot of time thinking about that are important issues for companies that are going to participate in the forward auction.
Bill, the Commission has been extraordinarily open in seeking input from all quarters. Are there any particular issues you want to highlight where the Commission is looking for the best and the brightest thoughts on that subset of issues, particularly from people in this room or consumer electronics industry in particular?
Well, we've heard a lot of issues. We are committed to doing the best job that engineers and economists can do with this auction. We're relying on some wonderful experts of our own. We know that many of the parties are consulting with their experts. We need the best and the brightest to help us do this right, and that's why we gave an unusually long period for comments. We do look forward to all the help we can get in the formal comment round, and then in continuing informal discussions with all the interests represented at this dais, including the Congress, to make sure we get it right. I'm not sure that there are any major sets of issues that haven't been identified, but I'll certainly agree that many of them are challenging.
So exit question, when will the incentive auction take place?
Our objective is to hold an auction in 2014. We know that's ambitious. We also know that it puts pressure on discussions which are ongoing with the Canadians in particular. But we do see an urgency. When the broadband plan was released, we saw 2015 as the year in which the burgeoning demand for broadband spectrum might create real shortages. An auction in 2014 would be well timed to try to meet that need, so that's our objective.
Just on that last point that Bill made, it's interesting, when the broadband plan was written, it identified a very serious problem that I think a lot of people didn't in the public understand, which was this surprise of the demand in data and how quickly it went up. Tablets, smartphones, they clearly identified something that was very real. What's interesting that's happened in the interim that I think fits nicely into the fact that we can do this auction right as opposed to trying to squeeze a little bit of spectrum out as quickly as possible, is that the wireless industry in the last 3 years the market's actually worked. It's reorganized itself in a way to make the most effective use of spectrum it can from an industry structure perspective. So Verizon getting the spectrum it got from Spectrum Co. T-Mobile with Metro PCS and the spectrum it got from AT&T and its breakup spectrum from Verizon and a deal they did with them. Sprint now fighting with Dish apparently over Clearwire. But Sprint has a ton of spectrum to begin with, and Clearwire is really underused. And AT&T now opening up the WCS band, buying basically the entire thing, getting rules from the FCC that worked, which was smart, and now AT&T into the near future is fine. So the market's actually worked. It's reorganized itself. It dealt with the surprise of the data demand, which clearly companies were surprised, as we all were. And it's reorganized itself to give us the time to do this auction and other things right, and do the things that Charlotte was talking about, federal spectrum, other areas, other opportunities. But I think the important thing here is the broadband, we're in a different world than the broadband plan now because of the way the industry has reorganized itself to account for it. That's what these guys do, and it's really impressive. And so I think we have the time. We'll get the auction done. We'll hopefully do it right and create more spectrum for mobile broadband. But again, the rush that was there in 2009, it's not the same as it was then.
So is that right? Less urgency? Does everyone on the panel agree there's less urgency? Charlotte, did you want to?
I beg to differ. I actually think that those are all things that were in the works, were going to happen, that is the way the market works, and it has been for a long time. And in fact, a lot of these numbers are actually bigger than they were back then. I mean, we didn't even have tablets, and tablets are now, they're going to outsell, what is it, the netbooks this year. So, I mean, I hear what you're saying, and I think you're right that we have some time. But what and I've said this while we were leading up into the legislation a couple of years ago, is that we often have trouble dealing with urgency and emergencies that are actually several years out, and that's what this is. And it takes a long time to get spectrum on the table. And we didn't even talk about the fact that you may have an auction in 2014. But when will the bidders in that auction actually be able to use that spectrum? So suffice it to say, we all do what we've been doing as carriers. We actually do deals all the time. We do make these adjustments, but that doesn't change the urgency to make sure that we get it right, but that we not delay it in such a way that it isn't available when it really needs to be.
All right, Mark, did you want to get a final word?
I just wanted to answer your question about the dictionary of the day, and I think it's going to be a nice little Christmas present at the end of 2014.
2014,
Yeah,
all right. Anyone else want to weigh in on the timing or the urgency?
I think
Paul?
they'll get it done before someone other than the SEC wins the National Football Championship.
That's probably a safe bet. All right, with that, a round of applause for Congressman Terry and our great panel. Continue to enjoy the show. Have a great afternoon, everyone.